Hi everyone, welcome to the History Respawn podcast. I'm your host Bob Whitaker. Today's episode continues our summer series on not E3 game news. In other words, reacting to game news that would have come out at E3, but instead came out in drips and drabs during the summer because of the virus. On episode 69, we discuss history game news that came out of Sony's showcase, EA Play, and from Sega. Today we'll be considering the events and news from Ubisoft and Microsoft's events. To help me wade through these topics, I've invited onto a show a leading panel of historians and scholars of play, including John Harney. Hey, John.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Great. We also have games journalist and Royal Holloway PhD candidate, Holly Nielsen. Welcome back, Holly.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be back.
And rounding out the panel, we have Rockstar Games expert and newly named lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University, Esther Wright. Welcome back, Esther.
Thank you for having me back also.
Well, congratulations on the new job.
Thanks.
So on the last Not E3 episode, we talked about events for Sony, EA, and Sega. In particular, we talked about Horizon Forbidden West, Paradise Lost, Humankind, Old World, and then Total War Troy, which came out just last week, actually. And before we get started with more recent news, I wanted to know if anybody on the panel, particularly Esther and Holly, if you had anything that you wanted to react to regarding the events from Sony or EA or from Sega.
Trying to remember now.
Yeah, I mean, trying to keep track of anything at the moment is really pushing my short-term memory. But yeah, maybe not. That's a terrible thing to say.
Yeah, I remember thinking the Sony one I quite like, especially in comparison to the Microsoft one, which kind of pushed all their indie titles into the pre-show. They kind of did a quick kind of, and here's some indie games. Kind of Sony kind of had them as part of their actual big show, which I liked quite a lot. I know a few people were kind of angry, kind of going, well, why is this little game on my big, PlayStation 5 reveal show? But I actually prefer that way better to kind of the Microsoft approach of kind of, and here's some indie games, and then showing Halo and things like that.
I definitely agree. I love that approach. And I think that's been a big part of PlayStation's business model, since the announcement of PlayStation 5, where they had a whole indie showcase that started off their main show for the PlayStation 4. So I think it's encouraging to see them do the same thing for PlayStation 5. We'll see. I mean, it was successful last time, so why not just keep doing it, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, let's get started with talking about Ubisoft. And as we start with talking about Ubisoft, we're focusing on their event, which they held on July 12th. But as you probably know, in the lead up to this event, we learned of numerous allegations of sexual harassment, of sexual assault against many members of Ubisoft's executive team and their leading content creation team. And this group included their editorial vice president, Maxime Belland, their chief creative officer, Serge Hascoue, and Ashraf Ismail, who was the creative director for many Assassin's Creed games, including, most recently, AC Valhalla. Now, the allegations against these individuals and others went back several years and related to misconduct and harassment that was perpetrated across the globe, not just in Ubisoft's world headquarters in France, but then also in their various satellite studios and headquarters based around the world. So in other words, this is harassment and misconduct that went on for a really long time and was pervasive throughout the company. And in large extent, it was also aided and abetted by Ubisoft's HR, which knew about many of these incidents and yet did mostly nothing about them. So in the last month since this news broke, all of those who were accused or were being investigated have now been dismissed. But Ubisoft has largely attempted to sweep this news under the rug. The company did not mention the scandal at their event on July 12th. And since that event, they've also largely attempted to focus on promoting their fall lineup of games. Now, typically when we get news like this, it's common for a large section of kind of the gaming audience, as it is, to argue that these disgusting events are behind the scenes and shouldn't necessarily determine how we perceive the resulting games. But in this case, in the case of this Ubisoft news, we also learned through these allegations that this culture of sexism that pervaded throughout the company also had a major impact on the development and marketing of their games, particularly the Assassin's Creed series. There was an important story from Jason Schreier at Bloomberg News that Ubisoft and their development and marketing team had chose to downplay female characters in their more recent Assassin's Creed titles. So this includes AC Syndicate with the character Evie. This includes Assassin's Creed Origins with the character Aya, and then Assassin's Creed Odyssey with the character Cassandra. And I don't want to speak for John, but History Respawn is Team Cassandra, 100%.
You can speak for me. That's
awesome.
Fair. Yes.
So all of this news is awful. It's awful for the women who were subjugated to this abuse and to this harassment. And before I turn things over to our panel, I wanted to say that for History Respawn, we've built a lot of our content on covering Ubisoft's games, particularly Assassin's Creed. And this news makes it really difficult to be enthusiastic about Ubisoft's upcoming titles. And to a large extent, it makes me personally embarrassed to have covered so many Ubisoft games, particularly these games in which the development process involved not just sidelining female characters, but then also sexual harassment and abuse. I know my opinion doesn't really count for much, but I just wanted to put it out there. So I'll turn things over now to the panel. If you care to share, what are you feeling about Ubisoft now in the wake of all of this news that we've had over the past month?
I know I personally didn't watch their event. I kind of caught up with the news and stuff that happened afterwards, but I just remember at the time thinking, you know what, I don't want to have to, I'm in a position where my research and my job doesn't rely on me watching this right now. So I'm just going to give this a miss because this is all very close to home and it's all just, it's just really awful stuff coming out. And obviously that it wasn't just, a few bad apples, it was a culture problem in the entire place, which is very difficult. But I've kind of caught up with the news, and it's interesting now seeing, especially with the Assassin's Creed stuff, seeing fans react. And something I've seen come out of it is there's now a kind of Discord group and a hashtag I've seen going around of like Assassin's Creed sisterhood, and kind of female fans of Assassin's Creed kind of voicing their, and just kind of saying, yes, we love these games, but voicing their annoyance at these kind of female characters that they feel haven't, been able to shine or haven't been able to give the recognition. And I thought that's been quite interesting to see this I don't know if I'd call it a backlash, but this kind of fans repositioning themselves to the games, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same as Holly, really. I didn't watch it live or, in the same way of thinking, I don't really want to be engaging with this right now, even though actually the stuff that I'm most interested in, the work that I do research-wise, is all about kind of specifically these sorts of events, these sort of marketing and this kind of hype and the way that these developers are trying to sell their games, especially obviously historical games, like I've done in my work on Rockstar. And it just felt like it's annoying because I have literally spent most of the summer playing for the first time Odyssey and I've just started Origins because through the PhD I just had no time. I had absolutely no time to be focusing on any of these games, and especially the way that Odyssey has completely drained all of my time because I want to do everything. But it's made it this kind of weird bittersweet thing now because before this happened and I was like really, really deep into this game as Cassandra, and now hearing all of this stuff come out and hearing the way that she was supposed to be kind of the focal point and all of this, I don't know, it's kind of, I haven't really sort of figured out how to sort of deal with it on a sort of professional and personal level yet, other than the fact that I've had to kind of keep a bit of a distance for my own, just for myself, which is a really odd thing to kind of deal with, I guess.
It's interesting, Bob, you brought up the channel's involvement with these games and everything. And my experience in teaching students of video games is that so many students who take those classes, who wouldn't necessarily see themselves as like video game fans, are Assassin's Creed fans. And the extent to which, of course, these massive corporations, you don't know what's going on, but if you just sit down and play the game, and I think of Ubisoft and that wrapper they've had for years of this game was built by a diverse group, et cetera, et cetera. Like, okay, they seem conscientious, and now I'm going to play my game. And like, you're not going to be thinking about these kinds of these interactions. But the Odyssey one is really interesting because, I picked Cassandra when I got the game, but it was kind of an online joke. I forget the male protagonist's name, but he's bad, pick Cassandra. But I remember
Alexios, is that right?
Yeah, and
I don't know.
In these massive games with narrative structures and everything, Cassandra she's better for a reason. So when that news kind of broke that, it was supposed to be her game and they kind of crafted this guy on, it's like, that brings a weird extra dimension. And, oh God, this is an awful thing to say. I feel like maybe gaming culture as a whole, like Gamergate should have punctured this, but I think some people have this idea that gaming culture is different in some way, in these very kind of antiquated ideas about jocks versus video game fans or whatever. And I was in a meeting a year ago with someone I obviously won't name, who was trying to explain video games to someone who doesn't understand them. This person themselves didn't understand them because he said the issue was diversity and stuff in a college esports environment, of making sure we want to create a welcoming environment for people. And this person said, oh, well, basically the males play consoles and the females play mobile games, which is this kind of canard, right? It's this thing going back, which is nonsense. And so in the same way, if you read into the details of the Ubisoft stuff, the harassment's on this continuum that on one end is just, powerful men being real. I mean, I guess I shouldn't swear in the podcast for Apple podcast reasons, but, unpleasant people in a work environment or a work party, being inappropriate. And so it's kind of, hopefully some people be exposed to like how that works, like there isn't a thick dividing line between the two. But I don't know. It makes me sad because I feel like this is just, Gamergate was this horrible moment. Well, ongoing in some ways, but I know there's more disappointment to come. These massive companies are not magically going to behave beautifully going forward.
Yeah, and some of this news, like you'd mentioned, John, is still ongoing, is still updating. For instance, Ashraf Ishmael, who was the creative director for a lot of the recent Assassin's Creed titles, he was only dismissed last week. So this is still very fresh, still ongoing, and I'm sure we're going to learn more. And I mean, I think obviously you feel bad for the victims of this. You also, of course, having been in organizations where this stuff has gone on myself, you feel bad for the other people who are there who didn't have anything to do with it. And, of course, when you're talking about one of these huge games, it's thousands of people who work on it, who give up a lot of their lives to publish these games. And now that kind of work is being put through the mud because of the actions of very key people in the organization, but not necessarily everybody in the organization, even though it does seem disturbingly the case that this was a very pervasive and global scale of harassment, right? It's not just something that's going on in France, not just something that's going on in Quebec. It's just about everywhere in Ubisoft's organization. And really, really disturbing to see it being kind of obfuscated by the HR department, which in some cases had very close relationship to the key people who were committing the abuse and harassment. So, yeah, it's a powerful warning, not just for the gaming industry, but then also anybody who's in a large organization like this. So, okay. Well,
if you compare it, I think Ubisoft and Riot become kind of interesting. I wouldn't even say contrast, because Riot is like the problem organization. I feel sometimes, the way that people talk, Riot can be, and they're working on it by stuff, and they are working on it. And I guess Riot was this cartoonish version of it, but it's the same thing, because it's just this culture of it. And again, yeah, the larger an organization, you're more, I'm sure we've all witnessed it. I've certainly witnessed it where you're like, why isn't that guy being moved on or fired or something? Because my female colleagues won't be in a room alone with him, but yet he still works here. That happens. So.
Yeah. I hate how, I don't quite know how to put this into words, because obviously I'm not trying to make it at all sort of trite and not horrific what's been going on, but I hate how it's my sort of immediate reaction whenever, I'd just be doom scrolling on Twitter, waiting for kind of news and things coming out, really, and just reading all these awful things and just like the bravery of people to say it, but simultaneously being shocked and not shocked, like completely, yes, Gamergate, the specter of Gamergate looms over everything and is still ongoing, and it has never really been resolved, and whether it ever will be, I don't know, but it's just not surprising that these things are still happening, even though they are awful, and there's like, they shouldn't be happening, in any situation, let alone a professional situation. And yet you see, oh, there's another story. And it's at what point, like, I don't know whether just, how do you deal with all of this coming out? I mean, let alone the people who are either working there or going through this themselves, dealing with this. This is kind of weird double feeling of it being awful, and yet you're just going, oh well, it's not surprising these things are happening, because this is a cultural thing, and we've had all these big exposés of sort of labor conditions for so many studios in the last couple of years, and it's just this, there are just levels of really problematic things going on, and this is just one of them.
And I know you'd mentioned this before, Esther, but I think in a disturbing way, this kind of adds ammunition to your research project regarding the influence of marketing departments. I don't think particularly scholars would have much of an issue with that kind of focus, but now anybody from the outside looking in, after this type of news, and after seeing what kind of influence the marketing department had at just Ubisoft, it's very difficult to criticize, looking at marketing as a really key point of not just historical games, but any type of games. To see the kind of influence they had over how the Assassin's Creed games were being developed is disturbing. And it's also fascinating because I think, traditionally, and, as you've written about, we kind of separate the development side from the marketing side. We see them as totally different departments, but here at Ubisoft, at the very least, you see that they're very closely intertwined.
Yeah, and it's one of the, because for a lot of studios, and especially I guess in a lot of the work that I've done, you don't really know. There is a marketing department, and there is the development side, and that is the kind of traditional view, but you don't really know who is kind of having the input. So to have this kind of concrete, more of a fleshed out idea of what is happening, who is making these decisions, and what is driving those decisions is, it's, from an academic point of view, it's really interesting, but it's just bleak. It's really, really bleak, especially when this is the outcome. And, obviously will firmly put myself on Team Cassandra too, but how can you think that marketing like a character like Alexios, I know I really glibly tweeted about this, imagine choosing to play as Alexios over Cassandra, and thinking somebody, one of these people at Ubisoft go, who were all about, has to be a man, the hero has to be a man. Okay, but does it have to be that man? I don't know. The mind boggles.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's briefly discuss Ubisoft's news, keeping in mind the news of this scandal, of course. From this event, which, of course, at the event they did mention the scandal or the news about sexual harassment, etc. They did talk about games. They discussed a bit more about AC Valhalla, and several journalists in particular got some time to play an extended portion of the game. I think they said about 3 hours or so. At least that's what I saw from several websites. And the response so far seems a little bit tepid. A lot of the writers are a little bit worried that the game is leaning a little bit too heavily on the mechanics that have already been explored in AC Origins and AC Odyssey. and they were hoping that the game tries something a bit new. There's a lot more news about the game's settlement system, which kind of builds on the RPG mechanics. So you've got NPCs, other characters in the game that are going to live in a settlement that you help build up. And I guess that's kind of part and parcel of modern gaming, where we have to recreate the real world in our games by building up make-believe settlements, etc. I don't really get into that stuff myself, but maybe people are excited about it. And then finally, with regards to AC Valhalla, we've got news that one of the first DLC for this game will focus on the story of Beowulf. So you can kind of see from very early on, like with a lot of other recent AC games, that not only are they kind of focusing on one particular historical moment, one particular historical time period, they're also kind of optioning off for DLC myths and other kind of narratives related to that time period. And you saw this with Origins, where you had DLC related to Egyptian gods. With Odyssey, you had DLC related to the myth of Atlantis, and the same thing is going on here with Valhalla. So I'll turn to the panel. Are we, in the light of all of this news, are we feeling enthusiastic about Valhalla? What do we think about their approach to this subject, this time period?
I don't know how other people feel, but I sometimes get a sense when like a big historical video game comes out like this, a part of me slightly dreads it, because I know if I play it, I'm going to have to think about it. Like I can't just switch off and play it, because I ended up having to review Odyssey, which as you're playing it at the moment, I had to review it and I was given, I think, like 4 days. 4 or 5 days.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so just totally ruin all experience of it. So hopefully I'm gonna not have to review this one, but possibly still play it and maybe enjoy it on some level. But I think a part of me, just in a kind of really kind of like I've been there kind of way, is because I grew up in the northeast of England. It might be set around where I grew up, and growing up in the northeast of England, you will learn about the Vikings and you will learn about Bede, St. Bede, at every part of my educational system. So I'm hoping to get Bede in Creed is my like hashtag I'm pushing for. And I had someone respond to me going, oh, well, Bede was in, so-and-so a date, and this is set in so-and-so a date. I'm like, you fight the Pope in these games. They can fit Bede in. They can make this work for me.
Definitely.
But the thing I found really interesting is that my dad has really gotten into Assassin's Creed games, and he wasn't necessarily a big video game player, but he had a knee operation, so we got him a PlayStation, and he got really, really into Assassin's Creed because he likes these big open world RPGs. And I kind of sent him a bunch of the stuff that had come out, and he was excited for it, but he made a point which I thought was really interesting, where, because I think they're bringing in, or they're having some kind of a like almost like fatality system, a bit like Mortal Kombat, where you see the arrow go in and there's blood and see the bones breaking and stuff like that, and you can turn it off, which then insinuates that it starts on, like you have to actively switch it off.
Probably so, yeah.
And he said, and he kind of said, he was like, I don't want that. Like, I'm not playing these games. Like that actively puts me off. And I kind of was thinking along the same lines. I was like, yeah, is anybody like, why have that? Like who is playing these games for that? And I just thought, so I thought that was and they're kind of like really pushing, this kind of brutality of the Vikings. And then they're also trying to balance it with, settlements. So they're not all just, pillaging. There is some raising cattle and things like that. And and it made me laugh as well when they had the, sorry, I'll stop in a second. They had the trailer where they kind of really showed the English king, and I'm going to be really bad and not remember which king it is. But it was very much a kind of like, oh, here's the evil English king sitting behind his, on a scary throne. And then afterwards they were like, but it's not quite as black and white as that. And I was like, but you made it that in the trailer. You can't make a trailer like that and say, but that's not all there is. It's like, that's what a bizarre, but anyway, that was my kind of many layers reaction to
like a lot of
Valhalla.
history game developers, they like to have their cake and eat it too.
Oh yeah. It's like, oh no, not, history isn't just about villains and heroes, but here are our villains and heroes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the one I've had a really interesting is a weird word for it, relationship with the Assassin's Creed games, because I sort of, a couple of years ago, I think Syndicate was the last one that I played for a long time, because I just I was like, oh right, I've climbed to Big Ben now. What am I doing? So the introduction of these RPG elements in Odyssey was actually really like, I was like, oh okay, right, this is like pulled me back in now. I'm kind of here for it. But what I really liked actually about the trailer, and what sort of made me think, all right, yeah, I might, really be interested in this game before everything happened, was this way of, I think it's like the king's narration about how the Vikings are, super bloodthirsty and they're terrible, but like the kind of the visual is the settlements. So it's them with their families or with the kids, and it is literally playing on popular perceptions of what Vikings are. And oh well, maybe they're not, But of course, obviously, it's one of these massive historical games. It isn't going to be necessarily as nuanced as the trailer would lead you to believe that it will be. But yeah, that's sort of, I was like, okay, that's interesting. But these games have always had they've always had a level of like understanding or being like this kind of self-conscious or self-aware of this sort of thing. But yeah, it's whether that will actually deliver anything beyond them just putting that on top of what they've already done in building on stuff like Origins and Odyssey anyway. And actually it's just something they thought, oh yeah, we can do this as well. We can just put this layer of self-consciousness on top, Yeah.
And so much of the, what you could call the historicity that they're striving for has to meet the audience expectations. So, if you're talking about Vikings, you need berserkers, dual wielding axes, etc. You need to have, like Holly mentioned, these Mortal Kombat-esque fatalities to appease video game players. And then, maybe if you can kind of sprinkle in historical detail, semi-accurate historical detail, you can do that as kind of a tertiary objective. But, meeting kind of the expectations of popular historical imagination is front and center, meeting the expectations of video games players front and center, and then underneath that is kind of the historical window dressing. So I think it fits in line with what they've done recently. Origins and Odyssey had these same sort of issues.
And they have the, you can play as a male or female protagonists that they did in Odyssey, which obviously now we know has a kind of much more complicated development story. But it kind of brings into question something which I found in Odyssey, which is like, I can't tell if this is just ignoring gender history, and or whether it's in a way almost liberating, because these games are a power fantasy. So is it liberating in a way to not have to worry? There's so much of these games that isn't that. I think I'd be slightly annoyed if I was playing as Cassandra and then someone stopped me from coming in a certain place because I chose to play as Cassandra. Is that what I'm playing this game for? And so I've never quite settled in my head of whether it is just a kind of whether gender doesn't matter to how the protagonist explores the world that they've created, or whether in a way that's quite nice. It's quite nice kind of just to be able to put that to one side. But yeah, I have lots of complicated feelings and argue with myself about those two different aspects quite a lot.
I think there's been a trend going on for a few years now, and I think strategy games are going to lead in the line here of an understanding, and I think it's mostly implicit as opposed to something anybody tried to do, of that history is about narrative, and it kind of depends who's telling the narrative and everything else. And I've been playing a bunch of Old World recently in early access, which kind of embraces this. Total War Troy, which is really building off Total War Three Kingdoms, is like, no, let's include fun interactions, the Crusader King 2 style, that these people are characters kind of thing. And I think that's all kind of interesting. And I'm trying to work on the Ghost of Tsushima episode right now, and it's just kind of a massive challenge because it's just really hard in the sense that I think that I could read something written about that game and go, I disagree with that completely, but you have a great point, and it's really frustrating because what am I going to say now about it? On the other end of it, I think Holly's point with the violence is really good, in that I remember being a boy and my father seeing me play Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo, and he took it away. It was this big moment in my childhood that like, you know, I wasn't allowed to play Mortal Kombat. And I don't know, it's weird. Some people, including people who work in the industry, are still in the thrall of this idea of what men want. Not even what men want, but kind of what boys want, I think. And it's not actually clear that boys do want that anymore. And anyway, even if they did, so what? Like, you know, and if you buy Mortal Kombat 11, obviously you want fatalities. That's clear, I guess. I'm assuming. I'm not a big Mortal Kombat fan. But we have this vestigial understanding of the, you know, this is going to get really super preachy historian now. We're not coming to terms at all with the fact that games have a pretty significant history now in terms of how we tell stories and the imagery that we use and the visual languages that we become used to and the tropes that we have. And, you know, obviously a lot of work's happened. I think our existence is evidence of this. A lot of work has happened in the last few years, but it's hard. I mean, I think to someone younger than me, the Xbox 360 is a classic console. It's very hard for me personally to deal with, but also to start thinking about how do we kind of engage with that. And it's why, that's why Holly's point of the violence was so good, because I'm at that point now too, where in some games the violence is part of the point and part of the narrative. In The Last of Us 2, however you might feel about it, they're deliberately depicting violence that way. The Last of Us 2 wants you to hate it. It's a really fascinating game. But yeah, in like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I'm like, I don't get it. I don't need finishing moves, personally.
If anything, it's just, you know, on a purely practical level, I'm probably just going to get annoyed that it's slowing down my my flicks. I'm having to watch this, you know, back break for the, you know, 100th time or so. It seems like very much kind of like just think of a bunch of stuff from games and just throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And then it's an odd choice.
Yeah, that kind of the finishing move type thing. It's a vestige of something like the Fallout series or even Skyrim, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of giving you this, this kind of cool cinematic moment.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, oh, but no, that's not how we're going to be playing these games for like 100 hours. I'm not going to want to see the same thing over and over again.
Well, Holly, I hope if you do get assigned this game, I hope you don't have to play it within 4 days.
Yeah, that was pretty brutal.
Be miserable.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry. I also wonder. I wonder, looking forward, how we look back on. I mean, is Valhalla going to be kind of the third in the trilogy? Are we going to think of it as Origins, Odyssey, Valhalla as a bag together? Because I think Origins is already a super interesting game to me, just for sitting down to write the history of games of the last 10 years. Like, Origins is interesting because they changed the mechanics, but they chose Egypt, which was arguably, you know, massively oversaturated in historical study in the West, but not really in the last 15 years, and not in the media space, not in video games. I'm just curious to how that's all going to work. So, because it almost already feels like Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla have these specific roles they're playing in our head of this trilogy, and Valhalla hasn't even come out yet. And so I just think that's kind of interesting where they go after that.
It's kind of very much like it's the mythic free, you know, it's got all your favorite myths in there, or your favorite, which I guess makes sense, because I guess kind of the point of wherever the actual plot of the games is now, it's all about, it's like the myth making of the assassins and of all of this. And so they're blending in. And I remember interviewing the creative director for Origins, and them kind of saying that actually going from Victorian London, where you're kind of, we have lots and lots of images of what this looked like, and we have lots and lots of historiography and all of this around it. And then, you know, the further back you get, it starts to get a bit more vague, or it starts, you know, there's still lots and lots of stuff about it, but there's a bit more creative license as a designer, I guess. And they've obviously really found a lot of freedom in that. And obviously on top of that, they're just mixing in kind of the best hits of the myths you might know. And I kind of like that, because I think, you know, these, you know, accuracy and whatever, these games aren't obviously accurate, so why not have fun? And also these elements, these kind of stories are important parts of the culture of these places, or they're important parts of that, and the kind of society and culture of the places don't really get explored in the games, because you you might see a statue, but you're kind of clambering over it. You're not really learning about where it came from unless you're kind of reading in a codex or something like that. So maybe kind of bringing in these myths as these playable things rather than just texts or rather than just bits in a menu is a way to explore that a bit more. I don't know.
I mean, it makes it more complicated for me to think of the culture of harassment that has I don't know if emerged or has been revealed to us. I think back to, we did an episode on Far Cry Primal a couple of years ago with Dr. Andrew Bird and Dr. Brenna Reinhardt Bird, who, they brought in like, hey, we want you guys to construct a plausible, Proto-Anglo language, not Anglo, Proto-something language, I forget now. But, what people would have
Proto-Indo-European language.
Thank you very much. And they did that. And Andrew and Brenna, they were gushing. They went up to, I think it was Montreal, and they had such a great experience. And Far Cry Primal is a weird game. Like, why did they make that game? Like, it's such a strange, like, let's make this decision and take hundreds of our people and a lot of our money and make this game. And we'll put Far Cry on it so people will buy it, but still. And so it's just kind of, it obviously doesn't make the cultural harassment worse. It's just like, again, maybe it's valuable for people to be thinking like you can't disentangle these things. That just being an organization with at least some people who are interesting and pushing ideas also has this other thing going on. And in some cases, it's the same people doing both of those things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you think too about, Ubisoft was the first game company to have a black female protagonist for a game with AC Liberation. They've also had many black protagonists in their games, and they kind of rest their hats on those kind of inclusions. But at the same time, these awful things are going on behind the scenes. And so
you kind of wonder how much stuff exists despite people rather than because of people.
Yes.
It's an incredibly complicated. Yeah.
It's hard to know.
Yeah. I find it really difficult because like literally one of my very favorite games is Beyond Good and Evil, which is Ubisoft, and was like this incredibly formative game for me. I had it, my first experience of it was on like a demo disc for like the PS2, I think. And I remember playing the one level like over and over again and just being absolutely obsessed with the fact that you could be this like female photojournalist. And this was your job and this was the game. And like, I don't even know how many times I've completed that game and absolutely love it. And it's like, how did that exist?
Yeah.
Like back then, like 2003, if we're still dealing with this stuff now, or this stuff is, now coming to the surface,
Well, they keep threatening to release a sequel to that game. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but
I hope. I remember being really, really excited initially, and they released like this sort of trailer thing, like a cinematic sort of thing, like years and years ago, and thinking, oh yeah, and then the more and more that came out was like, no, please never release the game.
Well, they're gonna have to include bloody camera finishers now, so it's a whole process.
Maybe they just want to make a Beyond Good and Evil film, but it could be like that Final Fantasy film with Alec Baldwin in it, which I can't remember. 20 years ago. Showing my age now.
Spirits Within.
Yes, I saw that in the cinema.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move from AC Valhalla, which could be kind of read as a historical allegory for Brexit, and turn to the latest Watch Dogs title, which is going apparently to take place in a near future version of post-Brexit London. And this game, I think, is interesting, not necessarily because it relates to history, but instead the ways in which it is kind of playing upon 20th century British history indirectly through things like CCTV, through Britain's long history with counter-espionage, Britain's long history with dystopian fiction, against the backdrop of authoritarian surveillance states. So I think this is a title that I think is interesting for those reasons. And I don't know what you all think of this, but I feel like the Watch Dogs series is one that it's a kind of a weird lineage, partly because it had a very famous trailer for the first game that got everybody very excited. The resulting game wasn't nearly as good as the trailer, but I think it's a series that has actually kind of grown in strength, especially with Watch Dogs 2, and I'm very eager to see what they do with Watch Dogs Legion, particularly giving the setting, and then my own, of course, personal interest in the history of surveillance and espionage in Britain. So I don't know. I'm curious about it.
Yeah, it's a really weird series because the first one was just not a great game. You know, it had its iconic hat and the world's most boring protagonist, and then they kind of came out with the second one, and the second one is a really interesting game.
Yeah.
And again, where you're just like, wow, they really kind of pulled it out the bag on this one. And yeah, and this one's been really interesting, kind of seeing, especially someone living in London and going through the dystopian process of Brexit and all of that. It's, and so it is interesting. I haven't seen much about it because a part of me is because Ubisoft are kind of one of the many developers where they're kind of like they love using politics, but they love denying that they're using them.
Absolutely.
That's like their big thing. How you can look at a game like this Watch Dogs game or any of this and go, but it's not political. Is comical. And so a part of me is interested, and a part of me is kind of like, I don't know if I trust them with certain aspects, or I'm kind of, but I don't know, maybe I'm being too sensitive and it's just hitting a nerve or something. But I'm interested to see it. I'm wondering, I don't know. I'm wondering if there's going to be a bit of like whataboutism or kind of both sides, or kind of a lot of stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know. I'm interested but hesitant.
Yeah, I think the perspective of the developers matters a lot here. You think about Ubisoft, they have, as a French company, they have a very long history of adapting histories of other people and not necessarily of France or French colonies, etc. And I think it's interesting they are adapting, kind of late 20th century, early 21st century British history for this game, for Watch Dogs. And I think that it fits in with their habit of adapting other countries rather than their own. But also, I think, given their perspective, they're probably leaning towards an anti-Brexit perspective because of their origin point. So I wonder if there is going to be any both sides isms. I would imagine that most of the development team is probably very anti-Brexit. But it's difficult to know without having played the game.
Because it's that difficult. It's the ridiculous thing now where, again, of like the marketing stuff where people don't want to put their flag anywhere. They don't want to be seen to be actually making a statement or actually making a decision, because then what happens if we isolate these, or what happens if we anger that? And it just becomes, like with, I had a really interesting conversation recently with Chris Kempshaw, First World War historian, and he was talking about playing Call of Duty World War II, and just this really awful bit in it where it kind of uses the aesthetics and what is clearly a concentration camp in Auschwitz, but they won't call it a concentration camp. They call it a POW camp, and they won't acknowledge. And it's very much a kind of clear sign of maybe not wanting to anger or not wanting to address. And it's like, you can't, so a part of me is kind of wondering, I hope that it's, I don't expect these big companies to create really radical, political satire or anything like that. That's not what they're going to do, really. But I'm interested to see. Yeah, I'm just interested to see it. I think it will be one I'll watch someone else play rather than play myself.
I think it's like. Oh, sorry, Esther, go ahead.
No, carry on. It's fine.
I was just sorry. Going off, Holly's comments. I can think about scale and everything else. Like, the British-French relationship can be interesting. I think you're rowing right now, I think, or your government is, I think, with the French, or maybe that's already over. I don't much. Who knows?
I feel we're rowing with everyone. That's just what we're doing at the moment.
And it's just so I don't know if they'll go for like the white van man that the Economist spent like 2 years writing about, or I don't know if there's like a Boris Johnson analog in the game. But then while Holly was speaking, I just thought of itch.io, purveyor of fine indie games, other things, and like. That bundle they did a few weeks ago for Black Lives Matter was kind of an awesome way to introduce people to like, insane, crazy things are happening on itch. And so if you want to see like Punk pasted together, I did this in 2 days games, or games took a lot longer, but have very specific aggressive political positions, or assertive political positions, I should say, you should totally go to itch. And so how the heck does that translate into a large corporation anyway? Not to be skeptical or say that it's impossible, but I think like Ian goes to Georgia Tech, is a great Twitter follower, and the grumpier he gets, the better he is. And he's been very grumpy for the last 2 months. And so, somebody earlier on made a point about, like Odyssey taking so long, and Bogost always complains that games are work, effectively. He's not complaining, he's just stating. So what the heck does Watch Dogs 3 even do? And then we have this additional problem of the aesthetic of playing, of like, is it good or not? So that, like you just like Watch Dogs series in particular, we have no idea what to expect. So will we get a really awesome, fun game that's kind of troubling and weird? A game that's kind of making really interesting points despite Ubisoft's marketing protestations to the contrary, but it's kind of bad. I don't know. For us, it kind of doesn't matter. We can just slog through something if it's interesting and talk about it. But then the impact it would have would be affected by that.
Yeah, I mean, I literally, as we've been having this conversation, it's been like pinging in my brain more and more, only because I've only just been playing it. I've been literally just catching up on all these kind of historical, in some way, games that I've missed over the last few years. But I've been playing We Happy Few recently. And, Bob, when you were describing kind of like what the new Watch Dogs is supposed to be, it was kind of like pinging in my brain like this game that I find really, really interesting. And I remember when it was a Kickstarter game, and it's similarly made by a kind of a Canadian company about sort of Britain and British history. Is set in the kind of 1960s in this sort of, I guess, future retro sort of psychedelic 1960s, but is, as much as it has a narrative, and this is one of the issues with the game, it's kind of about dealing with collective memory of the Second World War, and it being this sort of alternate history in which the Nazi Germany won the war, and there was this very shameful episode in the history of Wellington Wells, this kind of English countryside, typical, very English countryside, idyllic on the surface, but dystopic underneath. And there being this drug that is created to make people forget that they gave their kids to the Nazis, essentially as a way of as hostages, and they've never seen them again. And yeah, I think, and I really enjoyed the historical narrative aspect of it, but I think this is a game that just like, it didn't know what it wanted to be. It kind of has all these sandbox survival horror elements on the one hand, and then this really, really super interesting concept that like I felt like I'd never sort of really experienced before, and I thought was really interesting. I wanted them to dig deeper into that concept where you have these like ruined keep calm and carry on posters on the wall, or you've got all these like iconographies of like Dad's Army and the Home Front and all this, but it never really kind of digs into that as much as it wants you to go and find like a million, I don't know, bottles. And just make all these things. And I'm not, it's not that I'm not good at those games necessarily. I have no interest in the time and the stress that it places on my brain, like having to make sure I have all of these things that I can then make a medication with or something. So yeah, I think it's interesting that I often, when I think of historical games, will think of maybe American historical games or these European historical games. And it seems that, I mean, I know there is a legacy of games about sort of British history, but this was something different. And I'm wondering whether kind of this Watch Dogs will be that sort of what I wanted from that game, maybe a bit more, and having this kind of, I mean, I'm obviously just hoping for way too much now and hoping for this kind of like critical, political sort of.
You are the kind of positive person. I'm the negative kind of like.
I don't know why, because I'm always so negative. Like, well, I say always so negative. Whenever, like you were saying earlier, when a historical game comes out, I'm like, oh, I kind of want to play it, but I know I will not be able to turn my brain off, and I want to write about it. And I want something, I guess, that will dig into these big things about like how British people, I mean, and I don't really count myself in this, but how British people think of themselves as a sort of a country. And like one of the taglines from like We Happy Few is, happy is the country that has no history, or happy is the country that has no past. And this just collective forgetting in order to be able to see ourselves as Great Britain and, we won the war and all this. And I want a game, or I want something, I guess, that deals with that in a satisfactory way. This probably won't be it. Like, I'm under no illusions about that. But if it's going to try, we'll see. It might be interesting anyway.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing. Like when you say like those games where they have I don't know, a really interesting concept, or it's kind of really digging into really interesting stuff, and then the game gets in the way of you enjoying that concept. And it's kind of very much like, it's like the kind of concept and the story just becomes a veneer for the same game we've played over and over again. And I think maybe one thing that I think Watch Dogs might be interesting for is that at least the kind of actual like mechanics, nuts and bolts of the game lend itself better to the actual, maybe the story they're trying to tell. Like it is like the surveillance and, you know, and all of that, and the kind of, you know, controlling politics and narrative and stuff like that. At least that fits with the, in some ways fits with, the concepts fit with the mechanics, which often isn't the case in games like that. So that maybe is kind of gets me a little bit more hopeful. And then I'm kind of worried they're going to do a kind of like punkish veneer over, you know, a kind of vanilla bland cake kind of thing.
Well, it is interesting, you know, they've got this system in the new Watch Dogs game that they showed off at this Ubisoft event last month that you take control of any NPC in the game, and that, you know, potentially anybody can be part of a resistance against this techno-savvy authoritarian surveillance state. So you know, maybe it'll play like a preview of post-Brexit Britain. Who knows? I don't know.
I mean, at least we don't really have a tech-savvy government in the fact that we're constantly losing our passwords and can't control it. Yeah, you know, so it's going to... This
can't communicate really important things about, you know, lockdowns or coronavirus or any of the things that, you know, we actually need to know about, so, you know, we stay alive. But
if anything, this might be like an aspirational game for them. They'd be like, you know what?
Well, they did innovate on eye exams, right? You just drive to a castle. And then you're all set.
It's super easy now.
In addition to Watch Dogs and to Valhalla, we also learned about the new Far Cry game, Far Cry 6, which will be out in the spring. This game focuses on a fictitious version of Cuba, where you play a character that is leading a guerrilla resistance to overthrow an authoritarian regime. This fits right into Ubisoft's portfolio, I guess. And this game, I think, you know, we've done Far Cry games in the past. John mentioned Far Cry Primal, for instance. This game, I think, might be interesting to consider with regards to modern perceptions of banana republics, or perceptions of recent Caribbean history, modern Caribbean history. And then mechanically, I think it's interesting. John, I know you've played some of the Far Cry games. This game is going to include a large capital city in which you're playing in. And so instead of running around in a jungle or out in fields, for instance, you're going to be dealing more with tall buildings and verticality. So I don't know. It could be compelling.
Could be interesting too if you think about. I actually don't know how the audiences break down these games. I'm assuming the United States is a big market for these audiences. Cuba's still a thing in the American imagination, and it's distorted all over the place. It's distorted, so I'm kind of intrigued to see that. You know, I was speaking to a colleague yesterday. He's an expert. He's an expert in North American history, but particularly Latin American experiences, and he's writing about Wet Foot, Dry Foot, and the Mario, and all these kind of things. And again, going back to Holly's point about Ubisoft, we're not political. They include it. So then, what they choose to include, I still think the gold standard for a production, for a game design company representing other cultures, is still the first few Resident Evil games and their representations of American culture. I think everyone should do that. Just surreal, some would say, insane B-movie. You know, Leon Kennedy in every film. So that's in every game.
Yeah. And then lastly, from Ubisoft's event, we also learned that the company has yet again rebooted their long-promised pirate game called Skull and Bones. Now they are turning it into a live, persistent game world with quests and characters and storylines that are supposed to fit the model of Fortnite. So that sounds more like a threat than an announcement. But I am curious to see what they do with it. I mean, I think they had planned something that was kind of first-person narrative, and then when Xbox and their Sea of Thieves game came out, they kind of changed it to that kind of model, and now it sounds like they want to create the next Fortnite with ships. So I don't I don't know what to make of that news, but there it is. So let's turn to Xbox events. And so they had a showcase on July 23rd. And this had a lot of, what you would expect to hear, news about Halo Infinite, news about a new Forza game, news about Psychonauts 2, a whole list of games that are going to be optimized for the new Xbox. But I thought for us, I don't know if y'all are interested in talking about Halo. We can do that. But I thought this event was interesting because of what it portends for the future of gaming. There's a lot of news about Xbox and their Game Pass, which is a system that allows you to basically subscribe to Xbox. You get a whole slew of not only upcoming Xbox titles when you subscribe to the service, but also existing titles and then past Xbox titles, which can include titles not just from the Xbox One, but then Xbox 360 and going back to the original Xbox. And so my question to the panel is, given this kind of move by a major hardware company and then also software company, what do we think about Game Pass as kind of the future for historical game preservation? Instead of collecting old games, instead of collecting old consoles, you'll instead subscribe to the service that allows you to go back through a huge catalog of games and replay them. What do we think about that idea?
I mean, I think as a player, I can see why it's enticing, but as someone studying, or if we are thinking about these broader kind of questions around preservation, it could be, it probably is a complete nightmare, especially if the whole conversation that's been ongoing about games as service, games as licenses, you don't own it anymore. There's nothing to say that you can then, you buy a Game Pass or you buy a digital download a game or any of this, and there's nothing to say that couldn't just disappear at some point. It's how do we account for that? And then, these things in terms of, if you're talking about general media preservation in general, games moves so much faster and in ways that we just don't seem to be able to account for. A lot of conversations, I guess, around preservation are still dealing with, they're dealing with the contemporary, but, we're still talking about things in terms of things that happened in terms of games decades ago. And we're now only just kind of catching up with that, let alone these things that are moving year on year, if not month on month. It's tough.
Mm-hmm. And then, like you said, with games as services and games with persistent worlds, does the game still exist after the servers are turned off? So, it's interesting. And, I've done some research on looking at older historical games, digital games. Went to the Strong library last year during the summer, and the effort to preserve physical games, floppy disk drives, things that are on zip drives, things that are on old CD-ROMs. That process is difficult, but at least you can still play the games. Whereas I think looking forward, it might be the case that given that everything's going digital, everything's going online, is staying persistent, it might be the case that we don't even have that kind of limited reassurance going forward. So I don't know. I just think it's an interesting issue for us as, scholars of play, scholars of games, to think about, how our work and our research could change going forward.
I mean, it's something that I've, in a slightly different way, something that I've been dealing with anyway, sort of in the research that I've been doing, because I'm looking at kind of digital marketing and digital kind of materials that are not the game anyway. The amount of time, I mean, it's at least 2 or 3 times in the course of me just doing my PhD that the Rockstar website, for example, that I was using as kind of a key source, underwent some kind of reformatting. And I would not only lose so the first time it happened, the Newswire section that I was, I got loads of my sources for my PhD from in terms of how Rockstar's kind of communicating with their players. It got completely reformatted, and then I lost all the comments underneath. or, you know, I've lost, like, there's link rot, there's, you know, polls have gone. And now I checked back the other day because I was getting some content there for a module that I'm planning, and it completely changed again. And I couldn't do the thing that I planned to do not a month ago in terms of, you know, a source analysis exercise. So even on a, you know, a really personal level, like in terms of digital materials that are not the games, this is hard enough, and this is a moving target, and the ephemeral nature of these things is something that, you know, media scholars have been dealing with for ages. But it's so hard even when you're not trying to get the game itself, let alone the game in addition to everything that comes with it. So much of it's already gone.
I think this is why I'm kind of very thankful for the research that I do, because my own research is I look at kind of like board games and analog games from like 1860 to 1960. So it's very unlikely that they're going to change at this point. It would be very strange. But I do come across some stuff sometimes where I wonder if this is going to be a thing that you guys are going to have to deal with more, where stuff will only exist in the archive of a company. Probably you have this already. And, you know, you'll go to this company and go, oh, can I access your archive? And they're just like, no, of course not. And so, and then you're stuck. You can't, you know, there's no other way to get it. And you're locked out completely.
Yeah.
And the thing I often think about is because with my PhD, I'm much more focused on play than the actual games themselves, is how the play of these games is getting preserved, how the actual player experience, how people feel, what they're doing, how they're interacting with these games is getting preserved, if it is, or how you can look at that. That's what I often think about, because I spend a lot of my time just desperately looking for all history sources and letters of people born in 1900 and trying to piece together play experiences and thinking about what people will be doing to kind of think, oh, well, how are people playing Sea of Thieves and things like that.
Yeah. You know, with regards to your point, Holly, I think it's kind of interesting looking at Xbox and their recent history, particularly going back to the 360, because I could see if you could get their records, particularly with regards to something like game achievements, that could give you, maybe not for your time period, but, you know, for people doing similar work for more recent titles, it could give them a real sense of, you know, how much of a game people are playing, how they're interacting with it, etc. But again, like you'd mentioned, you know, getting those records, it's probably impossible, honestly. And, you know, one thing I did want to briefly mention is that with reference to the Strong Library, there was news this summer in which a lot of Nintendo's corporate information, their archives were hacked into, and a lot of the information about past and then Nintendo titles development was released online. And interestingly, the Strong Museum, which has some holdings of Nintendo ephemera, mostly, not a bunch of development information, but kind of marketing stuff, they've remained largely silent on the release of those documents. And I think it's partly because of playing this political game of trying to get Nintendo to give them this information, to give them the archives. And maybe that kind of event for Nintendo might encourage them to hand over the archives to somebody else to kind of keep them safe. I don't know, but I did
Nintendo
I want to mention
that. Very. I remember once having to review like a really like, you know, flash in the pan 3DS game, and I had to sign an NDA like super thick and being like, you can't mention the color of the curtains, and like really specific. Nintendo are have a very high hold over their content.
Yeah.
It makes me think, just as someone who plays games, however, because growing up, I didn't have PlayStation 4 was my first PlayStation, and then 360 was my first Xbox. And before that, like, it was mainly like Nintendo or handheld stuff. And so I kind of missed out on a lot of kind of key, you know, stuff where people will reference, you know, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, like, you know, these really kind of key reference points I just had no concept of. And you can see why, you know, people are getting more and more interested, especially as players, like kind of new players are coming through. They're like, well, what actually, you know, if you mention the original Metal Gear Solid or, you know, an early Final Fantasy game, how many young players have actually know those games, or do they just know them as reference points for these newer games? And actually having a Game Pass or something, which means that you don't pirate games, you know, obviously this is a company's way of kind of having control over their past content. So people don't have to go and pirate. They can come and, you know, you just subscribe and you can play it here. I can definitely see the appeal of that, because if you're like, well, all these past games are here, you'll go, well, great, because I never had a chance to play them as a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I can totally see the appeal of that, especially as a way of trying to combat, you know, pirating and downloading and things like that.
Yeah, and even an oldie like me, I have some of these old consoles, but I don't have the technology. I don't have a CRTV anymore to plug them into, right? So
yeah, it takes dedication.
It takes really a lot of dedication and a lot of storage space that I just don't have, particularly with 2 kids. And so, you know, I think the convenience factor, even for somebody who's played these games before, is really attractive and really interesting.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, part of me is a bit nihilistic, I suppose, in the sense that being an historian, being an historian is I'm going to sketch out the best incomplete picture I can, and that is the sadness I live with, and that is why my books take longer to write than they should, because it's just mostly emotionally grappling with the fact that I can't tell you exactly what the heck happened. And you know, you have this in the classroom sometimes with students, in particular when I teach samurai and things. There's a certain kind of student who really wants to tell me, you know, this is how such a battle happened. I'm like, well, I mean, you know, maybe. Also, I don't care about that battle. But you know, there is an interesting subculture of people who are, and you have all the various ways you can recreate this with tech, and there's such a hardware side to it, which is interesting, actually. And I've been reading about the history of computing a lot recently, and this kind of divergence between hardware and software. Of course, you have that in video games as well. But like, do you have to play Super Mario Brothers 2 or the Japanese game, the other game which it was based, on a CRT? Does that mean that I have to read Dickens by candlelight? You know, and in the same way, I think back to secondary school and college, and I'll give the listeners an insight into how rocking John Harney's youth was. My friends and I decided we would catch up on the classics over a year, and you had these Penguin classics and Waterstones that were £1 a copy. You know, and I'd get Anna Karenina, and then I'd get, you know, I'm trying now. I can't think of any classics, of course, because we're recording this podcast.
Oliver
but, you know,
Twist.
Thank you. You know, exactly. I worked through Dickens and all these things. And is there a way to do that for a young gamer now? And would they even want to? And won't they just play the inevitable Metal Gear Solid remake, Final Fantasy VII remake, and so on and so on? It's not the same thing. Do we want them to do that? And then at the same time, I think Europe is the same, but I know in the US, digital humanities has evolved from being something you put on your CV when you're begging for a job to something that you still do that, but now it's actually becoming much more of a real thing. And I need to go back to it. I went to the Digital Library Foundation's national conference a couple of years ago, and it was awesome, and it was cool, and it was exciting. And there's some awesome archivists out there. But I don't know how this all comes together, because Strong is awesome, but Strong is kind of on its own at the moment.
Yeah.
Like Richard Garriott, this is going back years, Bob. When you and I were at Texas, I was once, I think I was helping serve drinks or something at that Globe Theater he made in his backyard, which is like the size of the town I live in outside Austin, Texas. And they were going to do this whole, what is now Strong, they were going to do that at Texas. And it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, you know, I'm not blaming, you know. So yeah, I don't know where the next steps are for that archival state of games, even on the academic structure side of it.
Well, and so much like Holly has mentioned before, so much relates to what relationship do you have with game publishers, game developers, and the companies behind them. That's critical.
I wonder if in a weird way you're going to end up kind of in the future in the position I'm in now, where all of a sudden there's this kind of the kind of stuff that I look at wasn't really taken seriously, but a lot of stuff that wasn't really collected, but it was collected by private collectors, and it was collected, you know, by you know, just individuals who are just or people who used to work within the industry. And now these people are getting older or they're dying, and their collections pass to, and all of a sudden there's just almost out of nowhere, like there's a huge abundance of material. And I wonder if video games will get that point where, you know, you'll have a couple of key people get to a point where they're like, you know what, I can't deal with this massive collection anymore. Here you go. And maybe, I wonder how much stuff there'll be in people's lofts. And
that's been a big narrative for a podcast I listened to, Giant Bomb. Their kind of lead editor-in-chief, Jeff Gersman, is somebody who's been in the game industry for decades now, and he has a huge collection of games, consoles, other ephemera in his house in storage bins, and he keeps threatening to just drive it off a cliff someday. You order a car drive off a cliff, or to try to find some place to donate it to. And unfortunately, he's had the experience, and he lives in California. He's had the experience with the Video Game History Foundation, et cetera, where they don't have the space to take his stuff. They would love to, but they just don't have the space. And I know the Strong is year on year looking for money, looking for grants to expand their space, because all of that stuff, it's great to keep, but like you said, sometimes it's impossible for these libraries, even big libraries like the Strong, to hold all of this stuff. So
I guess I'm lucky in the fact that the stuff I look at is on cardboard, so you can kind of be like, yeah, it's ephemera. Sure, stick it there. That's fine.
I mean, our little library here, it's a small liberal arts college library, so it's never been meant to be a research library or anything like that. They're throwing out a bunch of books, and so I was in the basement the other day, and I figure everything up to 1955 I can count as a primary source now, because I want to talk about American attitudes about China, and I'll go back as far as 85, certainly 1990. This should be in my office, I guess. And 55 to 85 is kind of lost. And it's tough because a lot of those books actually tell you what happened when, like, Mao Zedong was put aside in 1959, whereas the modern books, we go straight to the argument, right? And it's interesting to think about it and this use of space, because one of the things librarians are doing, and certainly in colleges in America, are rethinking how the library can be an active part of the fabric of the community, the college community. And for some administrators, and I'm not talking about Centre now, but just I've seen other places certainly, books aren't a part of that. And so when books are under pressure, how do you say, hey, we have this whole other collection of media stuff, and by the way, they'll need their own power banks and all these kinds of things. But I think it's a great point about the donation stuff, because I used to work at DePaul in Chicago, and they're just open to the city, and people would walk in and they get amazing things donated. And they also get very strange people who want things that they don't want. And then I think, it reminds me, I used to work with Lisa Siegel at DePaul. She's a historian of sex. And she for a couple of times, she went to this archive somewhere up in the Northeast because she was interested in scrimshaw, whalers and so on, scraping images and things into bones and stuff. And she's an historian of sex. And it turns out that these guys were, they were very lonely while they were at sea. But this archive was run by descendants of some guy, right? And so they were like, oh, no, you've completely misunderstood, our material. And so I'm like, so what would that look like, 80 years from now? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Is there some odd person? Like, I could think of the various weird Hideo Kojima sub archives.
Oh, God.
So I think there's also the aspect of kind of adapting the legal practices of an archive to these different objects. So I remember I had a really weird experience where I went to Princeton to work from the Coates Children's Library, because they had a bunch of board games I wanted to look at. And I went there, and they obviously had, the usual, sign this, you can't. But unfortunately, all the legal kind of stuff they gave me, it's all related to books. It was all about books. And of course, I wasn't looking at books. And so it was stuff like, oh, you can't photograph more than a third of the book and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, how does this translate? Can I only photograph a third of the board? And and it ended up going this huge back and forth. Like, most of my time spent there was just trying to, what's the middle ground here? And eventually they were just like, oh, it doesn't matter. Just take some images and that kind of thing. And, but it was every aspect of the experience was catered to books. And even though they had this, this huge, amazing collection of non-book material, and it was just really interesting that it was just not an aspect ready to be that kind of legal aspect, was just a real issue.
All right, well, so that does it for Xbox and their event. And I'm just curious, out of all of this news throughout the summer with not E3, is there anything that y'all are looking forward to? And I guess I'll turn to Holly first and ask, anything that has caught your eye, any games you're looking forward to playing? Are you planning on getting a new console? What's the story?
I'll probably get a new console because I can justify it as a work cost. So
Clever.
I can be like, I have to. This is, I give this thing for part of my work. So yes, I was trying to think of games that I'm excited for. I'm sure they exist, but I'm really drawing a blank right now. I'm totally drawing a blank. I was looking around my office trying to think. I cannot think off the top of my head. But yeah, I will probably be getting new consoles.
Is there one that you're leaning towards?
Honestly, I have no idea. I'm kind of one of these people where you know, there'll be like numbers and gigabytes and stuff are flashing on the screen. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't care. As long as it runs and I can play stuff I want to play and it, you know, the UI isn't totally impenetrable, then I'll give it a go. So it will probably just be with my flatmates, whichever one we decide is, you know, is fine. But yeah, I guess more and more I'm kind of leaning, I think especially having to like spend more time writing and working about these bigger games, I spend more and more of my personal time enjoying smaller games and kind of indie titles and things like that, just because, I don't know, that's just tends to be, I find some, I don't know, more interesting stuff.
Yeah. Esther, what about you? Are you planning to expense a new console to your new job? It seems perfectly reasonable. I mean, digital history, you've got to have all of the new consoles day one.
I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to be like, should I say this? I probably shouldn't say this. But no, like I do. This is the thing. Like, I'm exactly the same as Holly in that I couldn't actually tell you a game specifically that I'm really excited about. You know, I spent a lot of my teenage years playing Halo, but am I really going to go back to that? Probably not. So I don't know. And again, like, I don't really feel like I necessarily had this like console loyalty. Like I had a PS1, a PS2, an Xbox 360, and then a PS4, and I have a PS3. But I'm like, oh, you know, and I just, I don't feel like I have the time to just sit there and yet compare, like, what's best? Is it I feel like this is just like a sort of, this is something you have to feel deeply in your core whether you're going to buy a PlayStation or an Xbox. And I will probably
whether you're going to force your university to buy a PlayStation or an Xbox.
Yeah. So I think because I feel like, I can justify it as a work thing, and I'm sure there will be some game at some point that I will need to buy. We'll see how far that research budget will stretch. I'm very much because I've started this job, and because, you know, this is a way that I think most of the humanities, like, you know, John, you were talking about this idea of digital humanities and especially history, like everyone understands that the digital is the way forward, like the digital, you know, it's like thing. So, you know, it's how, and especially if I'm running a full module, a full double semester module on digital games and the practice of history this year in how many weeks? 6 weeks. You know, how can we actually make sure that students have got the resources that they need? Like, we actually do need to start having conversations about, can they use PS4s, PS5s, Xboxes? You know, we can't expect them to all have one. Like, they need to be able to actually have these things at their disposal that the university is actually providing, because otherwise how else are they going to do the work that we're expecting of them? So yeah, as a work thing, you know, quote unquote work thing, I will be getting something. What that is, I have no idea. For the time being, honestly, aside from playing all these games that I have missed over the last few years that are historical and that I will need to be teaching with or probably writing something about at some point, I have mostly just been on my Switch playing Animal Crossing as a escape from everything else going on in the last few months. And it's just, I mean, that is probably the most hours I've sunk into anything other than maybe Odyssey the last few months.
I've had the weird thing at the moment where I've gone like, there's like two games that are holding my attention at the moment, and they're so polar opposite. I find it really funny, where I've gotten really into the remake of Harvest Moon, or Story of Seasons because of legal reasons, Friends of Mineral Town, which the original game was like one of my all-time favorite games, just fantastic. And replaying the remake, which is a very different game but still a fantastic game, and then I'm playing Bloodborne for the first time. So just kind of really just pushing my brain to different areas with those, just really hitting, but I'm actually finding them really good. They're similar in the way of kind of like distractions from work stress and general world falling apart stress. Of Harvest Moon is this very much, you know, this is my thesis on why Dark Souls likes and Bloodborne is exactly the same as Harvest Moon, in that you're kind of doing this, you're kind of going through this repetitive cycle, and in a way you kind of like you know, going through a certain area in Bloodborne and kind of knowing exactly where the enemies are and getting the hit at the right time, to me is almost hitting exactly the same buttons as knowing exactly where my crops are and pressing, you know, the watering button at the same time, and kind of really, you know, honing your like timing on these things. And by focusing on that, you get to kind of drown out everything else. But because at first I was like, oh, they're really different. And then I was like, oh no, I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm treating them, I'm treating them the same way.
Yeah.
John, what about you?
What I wanted to, I was going to say Souls-like games actually for me, this is such an old man thing to say. It's a bit like woodworking where like I'm so focused, I just don't think about anything else.
Yeah.
Feel calm. And the thing I was going to say about, digital equipment in the academy, my experience in the US is that nobody cares. And then one day this person walks in who's never shown any interest in anything you're doing, or in fact has been hostile to it. And they talk for like 20 minutes about virtual reality and they want to buy like 10 VR headsets. And I'm like, I'm not going to use those.
Yeah.
I mean, you could get them if I get to use one, but experience. I have no next console thing. I don't think I'll be getting a console anytime soon because I have kids and mortgage and things. I'm super excited about Spelunky 2. I hope Microsoft's vision for the future works because that would allow me to play games on my PC a lot. But I tried this with Microsoft Flight Simulator, and Xbox Game Pass for PC won't install anything on the drive I actually put software on because there's room on it. And it said, you don't have permission on the computer that you own and built yourself from scratch. So it's like, okay. So go through this menu to do it. No, can't do that. It goes on like this. So I won't bore everybody. But it was all a very retro experience because the answer turned out to be run with administrator. That was the long version. I now own it on Steam. The media thing, just the Xbox Game Pass never worked. But my story ended with run with administrator, which was super, super annoying. But that's where I am. So I'm hoping Microsoft, of all corporations, will magically figure this out, and then we can all live in a glorious future. So I'll buy a PS5 this time next year. That's basically what I'm saying.
Trusting Microsoft with our future. That sounds like a dangerous idea.
Yeah, they're known for their efficient, user-friendly software. I don't see the problem.
For myself, because I'm a gaming degenerate, I'm definitely going to buy a PlayStation 5. And as far as games I'm looking forward to, I would have said AC Valhalla, but I have very conflicted feelings about that game right now. I'd say that, I'm looking forward to whatever the next big indie title is. There's always something that comes out around the console launch that really grabs a lot of attention. So I'm looking forward to that. And, as far as what I've been playing recently, I started the most recent God of War game on PlayStation 4, partly out of curiosity. I went through a spell during my 20s where I didn't play games, roughly from 2001 to 2007, and it was actually John Harney's fault for getting me back into games. But I missed all of the original God of War games, so I've never played one up until this point. And I played it partly because of that curiosity, but then also maybe perhaps covering it for History Respawn and looking at the ways in which Viking history mythology has been adapted by games leading up to AC Valhalla. But now with the issues with Ubisoft and kind of just the general state of the world, I don't know if I'm going to be doing that. But it's an interesting game. It's a third-person combat game, and so my old arthritic hands aren't very good at those types of games. But I've put it on easy. I'm just kind of there for the story and the atmosphere and occasional button mashing when I have to do it. But I don't know. I'm hopeful for the kind of emerging future of games this fall, but at the same time, I think that the industry and gaming in general has got a lot of issues that I would have hoped they would have worked out by this point, but it just hasn't been the case. So I'm not feeling very enthusiastic, in other words.
That's very 2020 of you, Bob.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's just reality wearing you down.
I know, right? All right. Well, thank you, panel, for joining me on this episode of History Respawn.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
And thank you, listener, for joining us on this episode of History Respawn. If you enjoy our work, please visit our website, www.historyrespawn.com. And if you're interested in supporting the show, supporting our work, please visit our page on Patreon at www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.